road home seemed to go on and on. The road continued to outstretch in front of the vehicle endlessly. The light that shone through the branches above the tall trees danced across the windows in random patterns. Every once in a while, a bubbly shone in your eye. The surrounding was filled with deep green trees, forming a forest above the road. The only sound was the sound of the car engine as it traveled down the peaceful road. It was so peaceful, it let the scenery it left the scenery falling. Although the road seemed like a nice one, it lacked every form of nice for both passengers. A middle-aged woman behind the steering wheel, who had a nice and short brown hair that fit her complexion very well. She wore a green V-neck shirt with a blue pair of jeans. Diamond-studded earrings decorated both of her ears, which perfectly shone between her hair. She had deep green eyes, which were brought out nicely by her shirt. The lighting seemed to make it even more noticeable. There was something odd about her, though. There wasn't anything odd about her, though. She seemed like an average mother you'd see on a TV show. But one thing that did make her different from average mothers was the dark bags under her eyes. Her expression was gloomy and sad, although she generally looked like a person who smiled a lot. She would sniffle every once in a while and occasionally look back into the rear view mirror to look back at her son, who was in the back seat. He was hunched over, holding his right arm around his chest and his head pressed against the cold window. The boy lacked any normal appearance. Anyone could barely see that there was something wrong with him. He had messy brown hair that went every which way, his pale, almost gray skin brought out by the illuminate lighting. His eyes were dark, unlike his mother's. He wore a white shirt and scrub pants that were provided to him by the hospital. The clothes he had worn before were so shredded and blood-stained they weren't even wearable anymore. The right side of his face bared a few cuts, along with a split eyebrow. His right arm was bandaged all the way up to his shoulder, which had been seemingly shred when his right side was hit by glass shards. His injuries appeared to be painful when really he couldn't feel a thing. He never could. This was just one of the glories of being him. One of the many challenges he faced growing up was growing up with a rare disease that caused him to be completely numb to pain. Never before had he ever felt himself get hurt. He could have lost an arm and felt nothing. That was just one of the many disorders that he faced. Another one that decidedly named him many insulting nicknames over the short period of time he attended grade school before he moved to homeschooling, was a Tourette syndrome, which caused him to tick and twitch in ways he couldn't control. He would crack his neck uncontrollably and twitch every once in a while. The kids would tease him and call him Ticci Toby and mock him and with fake twitching and laughing. It got so bad that he turned to homeschooling. It was so hard for him to be in a common learning environment when it seemed every kid was poking, or more like stabbing fun at him. Toby stared blankly out the window. His face was empty of any describable emotions. Every few minute, his shoulder, arm, or foot would twitch. Every bump the car hit would make his stomach turn. Toby Rogers was the boy's name, and the last thing Toby remembered riding in a car was when it crashed. That's all he thought about, uncontrollably replaying what he had remembered before blacking out over and over again. Toby had been the lucky one when his sister wasn't so lucky. When the thought of his older sister came to mind, he couldn't help but let his eyes get teary. The horrible memory replayed in his mind. Her screaming had been cut off when the front car was smashed in. It all went blank for a moment before Toby opened his eyes, seeing his sister's body. Her forehead was pierced with glass shards, and her hips and legs had been crushed under the force of the steering wheel. her torso pushed in from the late inflated airbag. This was the last thing he had seen of his dear old sister. The road continued on for what seemed like forever. It took so long because his mother decided to take the long way, avoiding the scene of the crash. When the surroundings gave in a familiar neighborhood, they both were about ready to get out of the car and step back into their old home. The older neighborhood, with quiet little houses all next to each other. The car drove in front of a little blue house with all white painted windows. They both noticed an old vehicle parked in front of the house. The figure who stood out in the driveway. Toby felt automatic anger and frustration take over him at the sight of his father who wasn't there. His mother pulled the car into the driveway beside him, turning off the engine and preparing to step out and face her husband. "Why is he here?" Toby asked quietly as he looked at his mother, who reached to open the car door. "He's your father, Toby. He wants to see you," his mother responded in a muddled tone, seeming less shaky. "Yet he couldn't drive all the way up to the hospital to see Laura before she died." Toby narrowed his eyes and looked out the window. "He was drunk that night, honey. He couldn't drive." "Yeah. When is he not?" Toby pushed open the door before his mother stumbled out into the driveway, meeting his father's gaze before looking down at his feet with a stern expression. His mother stood out beside the car and met her husband's eyes before walking around the car. His father opened his eyes, expecting a hug from his wife, but she walked past him, putting her arm around Toby, and influencing him to walk inside. "Connie," her husband began in a deep, raspy voice. "No welcome home hug, huh?" She ignored her husband's and walked in past with her son under his arms. "Hey, he's 16, he can walk by himself." His father began to follow them in. "He's 17. Connie glanced back at him, opening the door to the house and stepping in. "Toby, why don't we get you to your room to rest a little? I'll come and get you when dinner's ready." "No, I'm 16. I can walk by myself," Toby said sarcastically and glanced back at his father, who stumbled in on the small staircase, then turning to his room and slamming the door violently. His little room didn't have much in it, just a small bed with a dresser and a window. On his wall, he had a few framed pictures of his family, back when they were a family, before his father became an alcoholic and acted violently towards the rest of his family. Toby remembered when he would argue with his mother and grabbed her by the hair, shoving her to the floor. When Laura tried to stop her and break it up, he pushed her and hit her back head on the counter. Toby could never forgive him for what he did to his sister and mother. Never. Toby didn't care how much his father beat him. He couldn't feel it anyway. What he did care about was how he hurt the only two people he cared about. When he was waiting in the hospital where his sister took the last few breaths, the only person who didn't rush there was his father. Toby stood out by the window, looking out. He could have sworn he'd seen something out of the corner of the corner of his eye, but he quickly blamed it on the medication he was put on. When dinner time came around, his mother called up to him. Toby came down the stairs and sat to the table across from his father, and in between his mother was an empty seat. It was quiet as his parents picked at their food, but Toby refused to eat. Instead, he just watched his dad with a blank stare. His mother caught a stare towards his father and elbowed him slightly. Toby looked over at her slightly and looked down at his uneaten food, which he didn't touch. Toby laid in bed and pulled the covers over his head, staring at the window. He tried, but he wouldn't fall asleep. He couldn't. There was way too much to think about. He had been debating whether to follow his mother's orders or forgive his father, or continue to hold a grudge with his boiling hatred. He heard a knock on the door, and it creaked open. His mother padded into the room and sat next to him. She reached over and rubbed his back, which had been turned to her. know it's hard, Toby. Trust me, I understand. But I promise it will be better, she said softly. When is he going to leave? Toby said in an innocent tone, with his shaky voice. Connie let her gaze fall down to her feet. I don't know, honey. He's staying as far as I know, she responded. Toby didn't respond. He just continued to look forward at the wall, holding his damaged arm toward its chest. After a few minutes of silence, his mother sighed before leaning in and kissing his cheek. And stood up, walking out of the room. Good night, she said, closing the door.
I took a pill in Ibiza to show Avicii I was cool.